Today, we're going to take these pieces and make a curved four patch. Let's do it together. Hi, it's Fran Morgan with Fabric Café, and today we're going to be making the Voyage pattern out of our brand new book, Curve Appeal with 3-Yard Quilts. Now we're going to be using these three gorgeous colors, bright, bold, and yummy. Wonderful golds and pinks, a great number 2 that picks up the colors in our number 1 fabric, and a wonderful kind of dark, rich Merlot color that really picks up all of those colors in our focus in our number 2. Make sure that you stay till the end because we're going to show you this quilt made in lots of different fabrics. Now let's take a closer look at what we're making. Now this is our Voyage pattern, and it is made very simply. We actually have 2 different 4-patch blocks. One is a simple 4-patch, which you know. The second is a 4-patch made with some curved piecing, and it's very simple. We're going to go through it step by step, and you're going to see how easy it is to put this together and how fast it is. Let's go do it. I like to cut all of my curve patterns before I start cutting my fabric, and we include all of the patterns you'll need in the book. I'm using freezer paper for my patterns because I will be able to press it onto my fabric and it will stick without leaving any residue. I'm just going to lay my freezer paper on top of my curve patterns and will trace over them. Now I'm drawing on the solid line, not the dotted line. And when you're tracing onto freezer paper, make sure you're tracing on the paper side and not the shiny side. The shiny side is what will adhere to our fabric. I also like to label the curve with what pattern it is and draw a little smiley face to make extra sure that I keep this side up when I'm pressing the freezer paper onto my fabric. I'm going to draw the other curve pattern that I need onto the same sheet of freezer paper. I just made 2 of each curve pattern, and that should last me the whole time. Now it's time to cut out our curve patterns. I'm just using some regular paper scissors to do this. I like to cut off the extra paper first so that I don't have as much paper to work around. I'm cutting on the drawn line for my curve patterns. So I like to cut all the paper patterns that are needed for the pattern. So just check your cutting instructions and it will list which pattern templates you will need to use for each quilt. We have our templates done. Now it's time to start cutting fabric number 1. I like to make my labels before I start cutting out my fabric. I just go down my list of cutting instructions and make a label for everything I will be cutting. I'll use this label with my fabric in a baggie so that I can stay nice and organized and everything is labeled properly. For example, from my fabric 2, I needed to cut with the fabric strips for my strip assembly and my border number 2. So I made a label for my strip assembly and a label for my border number 2. You'll follow the same process for all 3 fabrics. Whenever I make my first cut on a fabric, I like to leave a little bit of room on the edge so that I can flip it around and square up that other edge. I like to cut all of the strips for all 3 of my fabrics before I start cutting out my curved patterns. That way I can cut out all of the curves at the same time. One of my fabric number 3 strips is going to be used for more than one thing. So I'm just going to set this aside and cut the remainder of this after I do my curve patterns. All right, we've cut all of our strips, so it's time to start cutting our curves. We're going to keep the fabric folded in half like it was when we first cut it. This allows us to cut through 2 layers at a time. Then we're going to follow the curve cutting diagrams in the back of the book to double check how we need to lay out our curve patterns. Then we'll start pressing our freezer paper curve patterns onto the fabric. Make sure to put the freezer paper shiny side down onto the fabric. We're pressing this on high heat with no steam, and we're just going to lightly press down. When it comes to cutting the curves out, I like to trim off the fabric on the side with my straight edge. Then I like to stack the 2 layers that have the freezer paper patterns on them on top of the remaining fabric strip. It saves time layering them like this, but if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can always follow the curve cutting diagrams in the back of the book and do them 1 at a time, or even 2 at a time if that's more comfortable. I like to use my ruler to get all the straight edges cut before I cut my curve. I just follow along that curve with my rotary cutter, using that freezer paper as my guide. This allows me to cut 4 at a time. After we're done cutting, we just peel that freezer paper template off and it's ready to use again. We're going to repeat that same process until we have 12 pattern A's from fabric number 1. I'm able to use that same freezer paper template. It has enough stickiness to last the whole quilt. It leaves no residue on your quilt either, which is great. We're going to follow the same method with our curve pattern B's. I always double check that I'm not going to be cutting into the selvage, so I'll flip the fabric over to the other side just to make sure that it's lined up well. Then I like to lay the straight edge of my curve right next to the selvage. That way I'm utilizing all of the fabric. Double check that curve cutting diagram page to make sure you're laying the patterns out for the best optimal fabric usage. And that's all of the curves from our fabric number 1. Moving on to fabric 3. We're cutting the same curve patterns that we used earlier, just using a different fabric. So we're going to follow the same process as before. Remember that strip that we set aside earlier? We're going to work with that now. We're going to cut 4 of our curve pattern B's from this strip. I'm not stacking my fabric this time since I only need 4. Those will go in their bag with the rest of the fabric number 3 curve pattern B's. Now we're going to cut a border extension from the remainder of this strip. We're going to have a little left over. I like to cut the width first and then turn it and cut the length. This will go in the border number 1 bag with the rest of the border strips. Now that we have everything cut, we're moving on to step 1 of the pattern, Unit A assembly. We're going to fold 1 fabric 1 pattern A in half, right sides together. Then we're going to take 1 fabric 3 pattern B and fold it in half with right sides together. I'm going to finger press the center of each piece just a little bit so that there's a crease. Once we have a good crease, it's time to put a pin in it. First, placing right sides together, we're going to line up the edges of each curve where that crease line is. We're going to put a pin right in that crease line. Then we're going to take our pattern A and line up one of the edges with the edge of our pattern B and place a pin there. The top layer of fabric is going to feel like there's lots of excess, but it's going to work out okay. We're going to repeat that on the other side. I like to pin it where I place the pin in the fabric and then come up and then go back down again. The reason why I have this extra little pin step in there is to make sure those edges don't shift. I didn't feel like I needed to do that on the center pin. I feel like that with multiple points of contact through all of those layers keeps it a little bit more stable for me. We're going to need to repeat this process for all our curved pieces. There are lots of methods to do this. If you would like to see some other ideas on how to put your curved pieces together, be sure to check out our tutorial on the Curve Appeal book. This is what I found to be the easiest thing for me. Try out a few methods, see what works best for you. Now that our curved pieces are pinned together, it's time to sew them up. I'm using my 1/4 inch foot to make this a little easier. I recommend using a scant 1/4 inch seam, and also I have a built-in walking foot on my machine, but I have it disengaged at this point. I felt like it just added a little extra that I didn't need. I also am using my default stitch length on my machine, which is 2.5, but you could also reduce that a little bit, which could make it easier. Pattern A needs to go on top. We're just going to slowly sew along that curved edge. I highly recommend working with your needle in the down position. This will allow you to stop and pivot your work if needed. I'm using my seam ripper like a stiletto to keep my hands further away and so that I can see the pieces better. But you don't have to do this. I also like to chain piece several together. As you're sewing your pieces together, it may feel like the top piece is bunching or pleating. But just keep going slow, and as long as your seam is smooth and flat and those edges are together, there should be no problem whatsoever. And as you do this, it's going to get much, much easier, and you're just going to get the knack of it. You've got this. And there we go. We have 4 curved units done. Now we're going to press our curves. First, we're going to press on the pretty side of the block towards our pattern A, or whatever your bigger outside pattern is, if you're working with a different curve pattern. Then we're going to flip it over and press the seam open. I always prefer pressing my seams open. I find it helpful for the curves to get them to lay flat, but also whenever you're joining your curved blocks, it'll help distribute the thickness right on the seam. I like to spray it with a little bit of Best Press to really lock in that seam. Once all of our Unit A's are done, we're ready to move on to Step 2, Unit B assembly. We're going to follow the exact same pinning, sewing, and pressing method that we did for our Unit A's. We're just swapping out fabric placement. It's super important to square up your units. So I'm going to do that before we sew our units together in our block A. I like to line up my ruler on the edge of my pattern A, the bigger outside curve. I'm going to square up all of my Unit A's and all of my Unit B's. Our units are all squared up, so we're moving on to Step 3, Block A assembly. We're going to start with Step 1, which is sewing one Unit B and one Unit A together. Note that the Unit B is rotated. I like to put a pin right at the curved seam to make sure that they're matched up. Be sure to take your pins out as you go. I like to get as close as possible to the needle to make sure my seams stay together. I like to lay my units next to my sewing machine facing the direction they need to be going. This helps me make sure that I sew them together in the right way. After sewing our units together, we need to make sure and press our seams before moving to the next step. These pieces matched up so perfectly. It's always good to give yourself credit when you do a good job. We're going to end up with 12 step 1s, just like this. Moving on to step 2 of block A assembly. We're going to take those units we just sewed together and we're going to rotate one of them. Then I like to flip one over the other so that I know they are facing the right direction. I like to pin at my seams to make sure they're going to match up. I line up my seam and put the pin through the top layer and then back up through the bottom layer right at the seam. Then you just sew like normal. We're going to press our seams and then we've got a finished block. We're going to keep going until we have 6 blocks. Time for step 4, Unit C assembly. The first step is super easy. We're going to take those long with the fabric strips of our fabric 1 and fabric 2 and sew them together on their long edges, making a strip assembly. We're going to make 2 of those. Now we're going to cut these into units. Our unit C's are cut, so now we're ready for step 5, block B assembly. We're going to rotate one of our units, just like we did earlier when making our block A's. Flip that unit over on top of the other and pin at the seams before stitching. After we've sewn them, we're going to press them. We're going to keep going until we have 6 of those. There we go, block B finished. Now for the best part, step 6, quilt assembly. I like to use a sticky note on my pattern to keep track of what row I'm on. I recommend laying your blocks out before you start sewing. That way you can make sure that all your blocks are going the right direction and are in the right place. After I've laid it all out, I stack each row into its own stack. I pick up the blocks from left to right. Then I take one stack at a time to my machine to sew together into rows. This quilt has 4 rows, so I'll have 4 different stacks of blocks. Once we get to the machine, it's always good to double check that we have the blocks in the right order. Again, I'm just going to pin where my seams match up. First row done. We're going to go grab the next fabric stack and keep going till all our rows are completed. After our rows are all done, it's time to start sewing them together. I like to pin at every point where my seams match up. I like to sew 2 rows together at a time so that I don't have as much bulk to work with. Then I'll take my sets of 2 rows and sew those together. This can be a lot of weight to work with, so if you can set up a table either beside or behind your machine to help hold that weight, that can make things a lot easier. We're almost there. We've just got to add the borders. To sew our borders, we're going to sew our long border strips end to end. I don't trim my selvages off first. I leave them on, sew 1/4 inch from that little line that the selvage creates. I use that as a guide, that selvage line. This is where the border extension comes into play. We're just going to sew it onto the end of one of our strips. I'll trim the selvages off with my scissors. These are going to get hidden when we press, so it doesn't matter if it's super exact. Then we'll press our seams open and we're ready to sew them onto the quilt. I always start with my side borders. I don't worry about penning. I just keep adjusting as I go to make sure it's straight and lined up. After my first side, I just trim it a little longer than the edge of my quilt with a pair of scissors. Then I keep going and sew my strip on the other side of my quilt. After we press our seam, we'll get a more precise cut with a rotary cutter. We're going to trim it even with our quilt on all four corners. Repeat this process for the top and bottom border. So close, only one more border to go. When I start sewing my border 2, I line the fabric up with the selvage just a little bit past the edge of our first border. That way I can get a nice precise trim after pressing. I'm using those scissors again to trim it a little past the edge of the quilt. This makes the border process go so much faster because I'm able to stay at the machine. We're in the home stretch, so I want to do anything that gets us to that finished quilt top faster. All we have to do is trim our top and bottom border pieces and we'll be all finished. We're all done. I'm so excited to have the top finished. I think it turned out great. Love the fabric. I think it's so elegant but bright and cheerful. Also, I learned that curves were not that hard. I had to practice with a couple first, but as I got going, they went really fast. I just chain pieced them, and I've added another skill to my quilting repertoire, which I love. I just love that. Now we're gonna go ahead and get this quilt long-armed and bound. Now, if you would like to see some information on binding, we do have a video on that does a deeper dive, so be sure and check that out. Now, if you're interested in the fabric that I was working with today, we have a kit for this. It is called Floral Fantasy, and just as a reminder, this is our Voyage pattern from our Curve Appeal with 3-yard quilts. Now let's take a look at some other fabric options that are equally as gorgeous, and look how different it makes the quilt look. I love this one. I love that the circular print on this fabric in Voyage kind of mimics that circular piecing that we have there, which is very, very cool, very striking, and very, very fun. This one is called Rustic Reflections, and once again, it is our Voyage pattern from the Curve Appeal with 3-yard quilts. Now next we have something that's kind of my favorite color combination. I love lime green and purple together, and this looks amazing. I think it just totally changes the look of the pattern, and it really shows how versatile this pattern can be and all the different looks that you can get. I love the way the dark purple and the green just really pop off of each other. This is called Sublime, that is the kit name, and once again, this is the Voyage pattern. Now next we have something really cool. Now we've put a print into this pattern that is really interesting. I really love the black in this that really offsets the print, and it just dances across the surface. It is so much fun, so bright and cheerful. This kit is called Glass Art, and once again, this is our Voyage pattern from the Curve Appeal with 3-yard quilts. Now, I would want to encourage you to try curved piecing as well if you haven't done so. I know I was just a smidge intimidated, but it was so easy. And once I did a couple of practice blocks, I had it down in no time. It was great. Now, if you would like even more tips on making curves, be sure to check out the video that pops up next. It's Fran Morgan with Fabric Cafe. Happy quilting!